Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, one of our Benvenuto Cellini episodes, The Necromancer, the Mistress, and the Assassin. There's a huge chunk of the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini in this episode. It contains the period magic, which was what originally drew me to this author, although I have cut out the bit about the unicorn horn, which was released over Christmas as its own mini-episode. That occurs during or slightly before Cellini falling in love. In this section, I also didn't originally include the bit at the end about the assassin, but I want to be able to call back to it later in a few episodes' time, because Cellini murders the papal courtier who had hired the assassin in the street, and this is a turning point of his life. Thanks to the LibriVox team who recorded these chapters. The narrators are Morgan Scorpion, Sue Anderson, and Sibylla Denton.
At that time, as is the wont of young men, I had fallen in love with a Sicilian girl who was exceedingly beautiful. On it becoming clear that she returned my affection, her mother perceived how the matter stood, and grew suspicious of what might happen. The truth is that I had arranged to elope with the girl for a year to Florence, unknown to her mother, but she, getting wind of this, left Rome secretly one night and went off in the direction of Naples. She gave out that she was gone by the Civita Vecchia, but she really went by Ostia. I followed them to Civita Vecchia, and did a multitude of mad things to discover her. It would be too long to narrate them all in detail, enough that I was on the point of losing my wits or dying. After 2 months she wrote to me that she was in Sicily, extremely unhappy. I meanwhile was indulging myself in all the pleasures man can think of, and had engaged in another love affair, merely to drown the memory of my real passion. 64. It happened through a variety of singular accidents that I became intimate with a Sicilian priest, who was a man of very elevated genius, and well instructed in both Latin and Greek letters. In the course of conversation one day we were led to talk about the art of necromancy, apropos of which I said, "Throughout my whole life I have had the most intense desire to see or learn something of this art." Thereto the priest replied, "A stout soul and a steadfast must the man have who sets himself to such an enterprise." I answered that of strength and steadfastness of soul I should have enough and to spare, providing I found the opportunity. Then the priest said, "If you have the heart to dare it, I will amply satisfy your curiosity." Accordingly we agreed upon attempting the adventure. The priest one evening made his preparations, and bade me find a comrade, or not more than 2. I invited Vincenzio Romoli, a very dear friend of mine, and the priest took with him a native of Pistoia, who also cultivated the black art. We went together to the Colosseum, and there the priest, having arrayed himself in necromancer's robes, began to describe circles on the earth, with the finest ceremonies that can be imagined. I must say that he had made us bring precious perfumes and fire, and also drugs of fetid odour. When the preliminaries were completed, he made the entrance into the circle, and taking us by the hand, introduced us one by one inside it. Then he assigned our several functions. To the necromancer, his comrade, he gave the pentacle to hold. The other 2 of us had to look after the fire and the perfumes, and then he began his incantations. This lasted more than an hour and a half, when several legions appeared, and the Colosseum was all full of devils. I was occupied with the precious perfumes, and when the priest perceived in what numbers they were present, he turned to me and said, "Benvenuto, ask them something." I called on them to reunite me with my Sicilian Angelica. That night we obtained no answer, but I enjoyed the greatest satisfaction of my curiosity in such matters. The necromancer said that we should have to go a second time, and that I should obtain the full accomplishment of my request, but he wished me to bring with me a little boy of pure virginity. I chose one of my shop lads, who was about 12 years old, and invited Vincenzio Romoli again, and we also took a certain Agnolino Gaddi, who was a very intimate friend of both. When we came once more to the place appointed, the necromancer made just the same preparations, attended by the same and even more impressive details. Then he introduced us into the circle, which he had reconstructed with art more admirable and yet more wondrous ceremonies. Afterwards he appointed my friend Vincenzio to the ordering of the perfumes and the fire, and with him Agnolino Gaddi. He next placed in my hand the pentacle, which he bid me turn towards the points he indicated, and under the pentacle I held the little boy, my workman. Now the necromancer began to utter those awful invocations, calling by name on multitudes of demons who are captains of their legions, and these he summoned by the virtue and potency of God, the uncreated, living, and eternal, in phrases of the Hebrew, and also of the Greek and Latin tongues, insomuch that in a short space of time the whole Colosseum was full of 100-fold as many as had appeared upon the first occasion. Vincenzio Romoli, together with Agnolino, tended the fire and heaped on quantities of precious perfumes. At the advice of the necromancer, I again demanded to be reunited with Angelica. The sorcerer turned to me and said, "Hear you what they have replied, that in the space of 1 month you will be where she is." Then once more he prayed me to stand firm by him, because the legions were 1,000-fold more than he had summoned, and were the most dangerous of all the denizens of hell. And now that they had settled what I asked, it behoved us to be civil to them and dismiss them gently. On the other side, the boy who was beneath the pentacle shrieked out in terror that 1,000,000 of the fiercest men were swarming round and threatening us. He said, moreover, that 4 huge giants had appeared, who were striving to force their way inside the circle. Meanwhile the necromancer, trembling with fear, kept doing his best with mild and soft persuasions to dismiss them. Vincenzio Romoli, who quaked like an aspen leaf, looked after the perfumes, though I was quite as frightened as the rest of them. I tried to show it less, and inspired them all with marvellous courage. But the truth is that I had given myself up for dead when I saw the terror of the necromancer. The boy had stuck his head between his knees, exclaiming, "This is how I will meet death, for we are certainly dead men." Again I said to him, "These creatures are all inferior to us, and what you see is only smoke and shadow, so then raise your eyes." When he had raised them, he cried out, "The whole Colosseum is in flames, and the fire is advancing on us." Then covering his face with his hands, he groaned again that he was dead, and that he could not endure the sight longer. The necromancer appealed for my support, entreating me to stand firm by him, and to have asafoetida flung upon the coals. So I turned to Vincenzio Romoli and told him to make the fumigation at once. While uttering these words I looked at Agnolino Gaddi, whose eyes were staring from their sockets in his terror, and who was more than half dead, and said to him, "Agnolo, in a time and place like this we must not yield to fright, but do the utmost to bestir ourselves; therefore up at once and fling a handful of that asafoetida upon the fire." Agnolo at that moment, when he moved to do this, let fly such a volley from his breech, that it was far more effectual than the asafoetida. The boy, roused by that great stench and noise, lifted his face little, and hearing me laugh, he plucked up courage, and said the devils were taking to flight tempestuously. So we abode this until the matin bells began to sound. Then the boy told us again that but few remained, and those were at a distance. When the necromancer had concluded his ceremonies, he put off his wizard's robe, and packed up a great bundle of books, which he had brought with him. Then, all together, we issued with him from the circle, huddling as close as we could to one another, especially the boy, who had got into the middle, and taken the necromancer by his gown and me by the cloak. All the while that we were going toward our houses in the Banshee, he kept saying that 2 of the devils he had seen in the Colosseum were gambolling in front of us, skipping now along the roofs and now upon the ground. The necromancer assured me that, often as he had entered magic circles, he had never met with such a serious affair as this. He also tried to persuade me to assist him in consecrating a book, by means of which we should extract immeasurable wealth, since we could call up fiends to show us where treasures were, whereof the earth is full, and after this wise we should become the richest of mankind. Love affairs like mine were nothing but vanities and follies without consequence. I replied that if I were a Latin scholar I should be very willing to do what he suggested. He continued to persuade me by arguing that Latin scholarship was of no importance, and that, if he wanted, he could have found plenty of good Latinists, but that he had never met with a man of soul so firm as mine, and that I ought to follow his counsel. Engaged in this conversation, we reached our homes, and each one of us dreamed all that night of devils. 65. As we were in the habit of meeting daily, the necromancer kept urging me to join in his adventure. Accordingly I asked him how long it would take, and where we should have to go. To this he answered that we might get through with it in less than a month, and that the most suitable locality for the purpose was the hill country of Norcia. A master of his in the art had indeed consecrated such a book quite close to Rome, at a place called the Badia di Farfa, but he had met with some difficulties there, which would not occur in the mountains of Norcia. The peasants also of that district are people to be trusted, and have some practice in these matters, so that at a pinch they are able to render valuable assistance. This priestly sorcerer moved me so by his persuasions that I was well disposed to comply with his request, but I said I wanted first to finish the medals I was making for the Pope. I had confided what I was doing about them to him alone, begging him to keep my secret. At the same time I never stopped asking him if he believed that I should be reunited to my Sicilian Angelica at the time appointed, for the date was drawing near, and I thought it singular that I heard nothing about her. The Necromancer told me that it was quite certain I should find myself where she was, since the devils never break their word when they promise, as they did on that occasion. But he bade me keep my eyes open, and be on the look out against some accident which might happen to me in that connection, and put restraint upon myself to endure somewhat against my inclination, for he could discern a great and imminent danger in it. Well would it be for me if I went with him to consecrate the book, since this would avert the peril that menaced me, and would make us both most fortunate. I was beginning to hanker after the adventure more than he did, but I said that a certain Maestro Giovanni of Castel Bolognese had just come to Rome, very ingenious in the art of making medals of the sort I made in steel, and that I thirsted for nothing more than to compete with him and take the world by storm with some great masterpiece, which I hoped would annihilate all those enemies of mine by the force of genius and not the sword. The sorcerer on his side went on urging, "Nay, prithee, Benvenuto, come with me and shun a great disaster which I see impending over you." However, I had made my mind up, come what would, to finish my medal, and we were now approaching the end of the month. I was so absorbed and enamoured by my work that I thought no more about Angelica or anything of that kind, but gave my whole self up to it.
Chapter 66. It happened one day, close on the hours of vespers, that I had to go at an unusual time for me from my house to my workshop, for I ought to say that the latter was in the Banchi, while I lived behind the Banchi, and went rarely to the shop. All my business there I left in the hands of my partner Felice. Having stayed a short while in the workshop, I remembered that I had to say something to Alessandro del Bene. So I arose, and when I reached the Banchi I met a man called Ser Benedetto, who was a great friend of mine. He was a notary, born in Florence, son of a blind man who said prayers about the streets for alms, and a Sienese by race. This Ser Benedetto had been very many years at Naples. Afterwards he had settled in Rome, where he transacted business for some Sienese merchants of the Chigi. My partner had over and over again asked him for some moneys, which were due for certain little rings confided to Ser Benedetto. That very day, meeting him in the Banchi, he demanded his money, rather roughly as his wont was. Benedetto was walking with his masters, and they, annoyed by the interruption, scolded him sharply, saying they would be served by somebody else in order not to have to listen to such barking. Ser Benedetto did the best he could to excuse himself, swore that he had paid the goldsmith, and said he had no power to curb the rage of madmen. The Sienese took his words ill, and dismissed him on the spot. Leaving them, he ran like an arrow to my shop, probably to take revenge upon Felice. It chanced that just in the middle of the street we met. I, who had heard nothing of the matter, greeted him most kindly, according to my custom, to which courtesy he replied with insults. Then what the sorcerer had said flashed all at once upon my mind, and bridling myself as well as I was able in the way he bade me, I answered, "Good brother Benedetto, don't fly into a rage with me, for I have done you no harm, nor do I know anything about these affairs of yours. Please go and finish what you have to do with Felice. He is quite capable of giving you a proper answer, but inasmuch as I know nothing about it, you are wrong to abuse me in this way, especially as you are well aware that I am not the man to put up with insults." He retorted that I knew everything, and that he was the man to make me bear a heavier load than that, and that Felice and I were two great rascals. By this time a crowd had gathered round to hear the quarrel. Provoked by his ugly words, I stooped and took up a lump of mud, for it had rained, and hurled it with a quick and unpremeditated movement at his face. He ducked his head, so that the mud hit him in the middle of the skull. There was a stone in it with several sharp angles, one of which striking him, he fell stunned like a dead man, whereupon all the bystanders, seeing the great quantity of blood, judged that he was really dead. Chapter 67. While he was lying on the ground and people were preparing to carry him away, Pompeo the jeweller passed by. The Pope had sent for him to give orders about some jewels. Seeing the fellow in such a miserable plight, he asked who had struck him, on which they told him Benvenuto did it, but the stupid creature brought it down upon himself. No sooner had Pompeo reached the Pope than he began to speak. Most blessed Father, Benvenuto has this very moment murdered Tobbia. I saw it with my own eyes. On this the Pope in a fury ordered the governor, who was in the presence, to take and hang me at once in the place where the homicide had been committed, adding that he must do all he could to catch me, and not appear again before him until he had hanged me. When I saw the unfortunate Benedetto stretched upon the ground, I thought at once of the peril I was in, considering the power of my enemies, and what might ensue from this disaster. Making off, I took refuge in the house of Messer Giovanni Gaddi, clerk of the Camera, with the intention of preparing as soon as possible to escape from Rome. He, however, advised me not to be in such a hurry, for it might turn out perhaps that the evil was not so great as I imagined, and, calling Messer Annibal Caro, who lived with him, bade him go for information. While these arrangements were being made, a Roman gentleman appeared, who belonged to the household of Cardinal de' Medici, and had been sent by him. Taking Messer Giovanni and me apart, he told us that the Cardinal had reported to him what the Pope said, and that there was no way of helping me out of the scrape. It would be best for me to shun the first fury of the storm by flight, and not to risk myself in any house in Rome. Upon this gentleman's departure, Messer Giovanni looked me in the face as though he were about to cry, and said, "Ah me! Ah, woe is me! There is nothing I can do to aid you." I replied, "By God's means I shall aid myself alone, only I request you put one of your horses at my disposition." They had already saddled a black Turkish horse, the finest and the best in Rome. I mounted with an arquebus upon the saddle bow, wound up in readiness to fire, if need were. When I reached Ponte Sisto, I found the whole of the Bargello's guard there, both horse and foot. So making a virtue of necessity, I put my horse boldly to a sharp trot, and with God's grace, being somehow unperceived by them, passed freely through. Then, with all the speed I could, I took the road to Palombara, a fief of my Lord Giovan Battista Savello, whence I sent the horse back to Messer Giovanni, without, however, thinking it well to inform him where I was. Lord Giovan Battista, after very kindly entertaining me 2 days, advised me to remove and go toward Naples till the storm blew over. So, providing me with company, he set me on the way to Naples. While travelling, I met a sculptor of my acquaintance who was going to San Germano to finish the tomb of Piero de' Medici at Monte Cassino. His name was Solosmeo, and he gave me the news that on the very evening of the fray, Pope Clement sent one of his chamberlains to inquire how Tobbia was getting on. Finding him at work unharmed, and without even knowing anything about the matter, the messenger went back and told the Pope, who turned round to Pompeo and said, "You are a good-for-nothing rascal, but I promise you well that you have stirred a snake up which will sting you and serve you right." Then he addressed himself to Cardinal de' Medici, and commissioned him to look after me, adding that he should be very sorry to let me slip through his fingers. And so Solosmeo and I went on our way singing towards Monte Cassino, intending to pursue our journey thence in company towards Naples. Chapter 68. When Solosmeo had inspected his affairs at Monte Cassino, we resumed our journey, and having come within a mile of Naples, we were met by an innkeeper, who invited us to his house, and said he had been at Florence many years with Carlo Ginori, adding that if we put up at his inn he would treat us most kindly, for the reason that we both were Florentines. We told him frequently that we did not want to go to him. However, he kept passing, sometimes in front and sometimes behind, perpetually repeating that he would have us stop at his hostelry. When this began to bore me, I asked if he could tell me anything about a certain Sicilian woman called Beatrice, who had a beautiful daughter named Angelica, and both were courtesans. Taking it into his head that I was jeering him, he cried out, "God send mischief to all courtesans and such as favour them." Then he set spurs to his horse, and made off as though he was resolved to leave us. I felt some pleasure at having rid myself in so fair a manner of that ass of an innkeeper, and yet I was rather the loser than the gainer, for the great love I bore Angelica had come back to my mind, and while I was conversing, not without some lovers' sighs, upon this subject with Solosmeo, we saw the man returning to us at a gallop. When he drew up, he said, 2 or perhaps 3 days ago, a woman and a girl came back to a house in my neighbourhood. They had the names you mentioned, but whether they are Sicilians I cannot say. I answered, "Such power over me has that name of Angelica, that I am now determined to put up at your inn." We rode on all together with mine host into the town of Naples, and descended at his house. Minutes seemed years to me till I had put my things in order, which I did in the twinkling of an eye. Then I went to the house, which was not far from our inn, and found there my Angelica, who greeted me with infinite demonstrations of the most unbounded passion. I stayed with her from evenfall until the following morning, and enjoyed such pleasure as I never had before or since. But while drinking deep of this delight, it occurred to my mind how exactly on that day the month expired, which had been prophesied within the necromantic circle by the devils. So then, let every man who enters into relation with those spirits weigh well the inestimable perils I have passed through. Chapter 69. I happened to have in my purse a diamond, which I showed about among the goldsmiths, and though I was but young, my reputation as an able artist was so well known, even at Naples, that they welcomed me most warmly. Among others, I made acquaintance with a most excellent companion, a jeweller, Messer Domenico Fontana by name. This worthy man left his shop for the 3 days that I spent in Naples, nor even quitted my company, but showed me many admirable monuments of antiquity in the city and its neighbourhood. Moreover, he took me to pay my respects to the Viceroy of Naples, who had let him know that he should like to see me. When I presented myself to his Excellency, he received me with much honour, and while we were exchanging compliments, the diamond which I have mentioned caught his eye. He made me show it him, and prayed me, if I parted with it, to give him the refusal. Having taken back the stone, I offered it again to his Excellency, adding that the diamond and I were at his service. Then he said that the diamond pleased him well, but that he should be much better pleased if I were to stay with him. He would make such terms with me as would cause me to feel satisfied. We spoke many words of courtesy on both sides, and then, coming to the merits of the diamond, his Excellency bade me without hesitation name the price at which I valued it. Accordingly, I said that it was worth exactly 200 crowns. He rejoined that in his opinion I had not overvalued it, but that since I had said it, and he knew me for the first artist in the world, it would not make the same effect when mounted by another hand. To this I said that I had not set the stone, and that it was not well set. Its brilliancy was due to its own excellence, and that if I were to mount it afresh I could make it show far better than it did. Then I put my thumbnail to the angles of its facets, took it from the ring, cleaned it up a little, and handed it to the Viceroy. Delighted and astonished, he wrote me out a check for the 200 crowns I had demanded. When I returned to my lodging, I found letters from the Cardinal de' Medici, in which he told me to come back post haste to Rome, and to dismount without delay at the palace of his most reverend lordship. I read the letter to my Angelica, who begged me, with tears of affection, either to remain in Naples or to take her with me. I replied that if she was disposed to come with me, I would give up to her keeping the 200 ducats I had received from the Viceroy. Her mother, perceiving us in this close conversation, drew nigh and said, "Benvenuto, if you want to take my daughter to Rome, leave me a sum of 15 ducats to pay for my lying in, and then I will travel after you." I told the old harridan that I would very gladly leave her 30 if she would give me my Angelica. We made the bargain, and Angelica entreated me to buy her a gown of black velvet, because the stuff was cheap at Naples. I consented to everything, sent for the velvet, settled its price, and paid for it. Then the old woman, who thought me over head and ears in love, begged for a gown of fine cloth for herself, as well as other outlays for her sons, and a good bit more money than I had offered. I turned to her with a pleasant air and said, "My dear Beatrice, are you satisfied with what I offered?" She answered that she was not. Thereupon I said that what was not enough for her would be quite enough for me, and having kissed Angelica, we parted, she with tears and I with laughter, and off at once I set for Rome. Chapter 70. I left Naples by night with my money in my pocket, and this I did to prevent being set upon or murdered, as is the way there. But when I came to Selciata, I had to defend myself with great address and bodily prowess from several horsemen who came out to assassinate me. During the following days, after leaving Solosmeo at his work at Monte Cassino, I came one morning to breakfast at the inn of Adagnani, and when I was near the house I shot some birds with my arquebuse. An iron spike which was in the lock of my musket tore my right hand. Though the wound was not of any consequence, it seemed to be so, because it bled abundantly. Going into the inn, I put my horse up, and ascended to a large gallery, where I found a party of Neapolitan gentlemen just upon the point of sitting down to table. They had with them a young woman of quality, the loveliest I ever saw. At the moment when I entered the room, I was followed by a very brave young serving man of mine, holding a big partisan in his hand. The sight of us, our arms, and the blood inspired those poor gentlemen with such terror, particularly as the place was known to be a nest of murderers, that they rose from table and called on God in a panic to protect them. I began to laugh, and said that God had protected them already, for that I was a man to defend them against whoever tried to do them harm. Then I asked them for something to bind up my wounded hand, and the charming lady took out a handkerchief richly embroidered with gold, wishing to make a bandage with it. I refused, but she tore the piece in half, and in the gentlest manner wrapped my hand up with her fingers. The company thus having regained confidence, we dined together very gaily, and when the meal was over we all mounted and went off together. The gentlemen, however, were not as yet quite at their ease, so they left me in their cunning to entertain the lady, while they kept at a short distance behind. I rode at her side upon a pretty little horse of mine, making signs to my servant that he should keep somewhat apart, which gave us the opportunity of discussing things that are not sold by the apothecary. In this way I journeyed to Rome with the greatest enjoyment I have ever had. When I got to Rome, I dismounted at the palace of Cardinal de' Medici, and having obtained an audience of his most reverend lordship, paid my respects and thanked him warmly for my recall. I then entreated him to secure me from imprisonment, and even from a fine, if that were possible. The cardinal was very glad to see me, told me to stand in no fear, then turned to one of his gentlemen, called Messer Pier Antonio Pecci of Siena, ordering him to tell the Bargello not to touch me. He then asked him how the man was going on whose head I had broken with a stone. Messer Pier Antonio replied that he was very ill, and that he would probably be even worse, for when he heard that I was coming back to Rome, he swore he would die to serve me an ill turn. When the cardinal heard that, he burst into a fit of laughter, and cried, "The fellow could not have taken a better way than this to make us know that he was born a Sienese." After that he turned to me and said, "For our reputation and your own, refrain these 4 or 5 days from going about in the banchi. After that go where you like, and let fools die at their own pleasure." I went home and set myself to finishing the medal which I had begun, with the head of Pope Clement and a figure of peace on the reverse. The figure was a slender woman dressed in very thin drapery, gathered at the waist, with a little torch in her hand, which was burning a heap of arms bound together like a trophy. In the background I had shown part of a temple, where was Discord chained with a load of fetters. Round about it ran a legend in these words, Claudentur belli portae. During the time I was finishing this medal, the man whom I had wounded recovered, and the Pope kept incessantly asking for me. I, however, avoided visiting Cardinal de' Medici, for whenever I showed my face before him, his lordship gave me some commission of importance, which hindered me from working at my medal to the end. Consequently, Messer Pier Carnesecchi, who was a great favourite of the Pope's, undertook to keep me in sight, and let me adroitly understand how much the Pope desired my services. I told him that in a few days I would prove to his Holiness that his service had never been neglected by me.
71. Not many days had passed before, my medal being finished, I stamped it in gold, silver, and copper. After I had shown it to Messer Pietro, he immediately introduced me to the Pope. It was on a day in April, after dinner, and the weather very fine. The Pope was in the belvedere. After entering the presence, I put my medals together with the dies of steel into his hand. He took them, and recognizing at once their mastery of art, looked at Messer Pietro in the face and said, "The ancients never had such medals made for them as these." While he and the others were inspecting them, taking up now the dies and now the medals in their hands, I began to speak as submissively as I was able. If a greater power had not controlled the working of my inauspicious stars, and hindered that with which they violently menaced me, your Holiness, without your fault or mine, would have lost a faithful and loving servant. It must, most blessed Father, be allowed that in those cases where men are risking all upon one throw, it is not wrong to do as certain poor and simple men are wont to say, who tell us we must mark 7 times and cut once. Your Holiness will remember how the malicious and lying tongue of my bitter enemy so easily aroused your anger, that you ordered the governor to have me taken on the spot and hanged; but I have no doubt that when you had become aware of the irreparable act by which you would have wronged yourself, in cutting off from your servant such as even now your Holiness saith he is, I am sure, I repeat, that before God and the world you would have felt no trifling twinges of remorse. Excellent and virtuous fathers, and masters of like quality, ought not to let their arm in wrath descend upon their sons and servants with such inconsiderate haste, seeing that subsequent repentance will avail them nothing. But now that God has overruled the malign influences of the stars and saved me from your Holiness, I humbly beg you another time not to let yourself so easily be stirred to rage against me." The Pope had stopped from looking at the medals, and was now listening attentively to what I said. There were many noblemen of the greatest consequence present, which made him blush a little, as it were for shame, and not knowing how else to extricate himself from this entanglement, he said he could not remember having given such an order. I changed the conversation in order to cover his embarrassment. His Holiness then began to speak again about the medals, and asked what method I had used to stamp them so marvellously, large as they were, for he had never met with ancient pieces of that size. We talked a little on this subject, but being not quite easy that I might not begin another lecture sharper than the last, he praised my medals, and said that they gave him the greatest satisfaction, but that he should like another reverse made according to a fancy of his own, if it were possible to stamp them with 2 different patterns. I said that it was possible to do so. Then his Holiness commissioned me to design the history of Moses when he strikes the rock and water issues from it, with this motto, Ut bibat populus. At last he added, Go, Benvenuto, you will not have finished it before I have provided for your fortune. After I had taken leave, the Pope proclaimed before the whole company that he would give me enough to live on wealthily, without the need of labouring for any one but him. So I devoted myself entirely to working out this reverse with the Moses on it. 72. In the meantime the Pope was taken ill, and his physicians thought the case was dangerous. Accordingly my enemy began to be afraid of me, and engaged some Neapolitan soldiers to do to me what he was dreading I might do to him. I had therefore much trouble to defend my poor life. In course of time, however, I completed the reverse, and when I took it to the Pope, I found him in bed in a most deplorable condition. Nevertheless he received me with the greatest kindness, and wished to inspect the metals and the dyes. He sent for spectacles and lights, but was unable to see anything clearly. Then he began to fumble with his fingers at them, and having felt them a short while, he fetched a deep sigh, and said to his attendants that he was much concerned about me, but that if God gave him back his health he would make it all right. 3 days afterwards the Pope died, and I was left with all my labour lost; yet I plucked up courage, and told myself that these medals had won me so much celebrity, that any Pope who was elected would give me work to do, and peradventure bring me better fortune. Thus I encouraged to put heart into myself, and buried in oblivion all the injuries which Pompeo had done me. Then putting on my arms and girding my sword, I went to San Piero, and kissed the foot of the dead Pope, not without shedding tears. Afterwards I returned to the Banchi to look at the great commotion which always happens on such occasions. While I was sitting on the street with several of my friends, Pompeo went by, attended by 10 men very well armed, and when he came just opposite he stopped, as though about to pick a quarrel with myself. My companions, brave and adventurous young men, made signs to me to draw my sword, but it flashed through my mind that if I drew, some terrible mischief might result for persons who were wholly innocent. Therefore I considered that it would be better if I put my life to risk alone. When Pompeo had stood there time enough to say 2 Ave Marias, he laughed derisively in my direction, and going off, his fellows also laughed and wagged their heads, with many other insolent gestures. My companions wanted to begin the fray at once, but I told them hotly that I was quite able to conduct my quarrels to an end by myself, and that I had no need of stouter fighters than I was, so that each of them might mind his business. My friends were angry, and went off muttering. Now there was among them my dearest comrade, named Albertaccio del Bene, own brother to Alessandro and Albizzo, who is now a very rich man in Lyons. He was the most redoubtable young man I ever knew, and the most high-spirited, and loved me like himself; and insomuch as he was well aware that my forbearance had not been inspired by want of courage, but by the most daring bravery, for he knew me down to the bottom of my nature, he took my words up and begged me to favour him so far as to associate him with myself in all I meant to do. I replied, Dear Albertaccio, dearest to me above all men that live, the time will very likely come when you shall give me aid; but in this case if you love me, do not attend to me, but look to your own business, and go at once, like our other friends, for now there is no time to lose. These words were spoken in one breath. 73. In the meanwhile my enemies had proceeded slowly down towards Chiavica, as the place was called, and had arrived at the crossing of several roads, going in different directions, but the street in which Pompeo's house stood was the one which leads straight to the Campo del Fiore. Some business or other made him enter the apothecary's shop which stood at the corner of Chiavica, and there he stayed a while transacting it. I had just been told that he had boasted of the insult which he fancied he had put upon me, but be that as it may, it was to his misfortune, for precisely when I came up to the corner, he was leaving the shop, and his bravi had opened their ranks and received him in their midst. I drew a little dagger with a sharpened edge, and breaking the line of his defenders, laid my hands upon his breast so quickly and coolly, that none of them were able to prevent me. Then I aimed to strike him in the face, but fright made him turn his head round; I stabbed him just beneath the ear. I gave only 2 blows, for he fell stone dead at the second. I had not meant to kill him, but as the saying goes, knocks are not dealt by measure. With my left hand I plucked back the dagger, and with my right hand drew my sword to defend my life. However, all those bravi ran up to the corpse and took no action against me, so I went back alone through Strada Giulia, considering how best to put myself in safety. I had walked about 300 paces, when Piloto the goldsmith, my very good friend, came up and said, "Brother, now that the mischief's done, we must see to saving you." I replied, "Let us go to Albertaccio del Bene's house; it is only a few minutes since I told him I should soon have need of him." When we arrived there, Albertaccio and I embraced with measureless affection, and soon the whole flower of the young men of the Banchi, of all nations except the Milanese, came crowding in, and each and all made proffer of their own life to save mine. Messer Luigi Rucellai also sent with marvellous promptitude and courtesy to put his services at my disposal, as did many other great folk of his station; for they all agreed in blessing my hands, judging that Pompeo had done me too great and unforgivable an injury, and marvelling that I had put up with him so long. 74. Cardinal Cornaro, on hearing of the affair, despatched 30 soldiers with as many partisans, spikes, and arquebuses, to bring me with all due respect to his quarters. This he did unasked, whereupon I accepted the invitation, and went off with them, while more than as many of the young men bore me company. Meanwhile, Messer Traiano, Pompeo's relative and first chamberlain to the Pope, sent a Milanese of high rank to Cardinal de' Medici, giving him news of the great crime I had committed, and calling on his most reverend lordship to chastise me. The Cardinal retorted on the spot, "His crime would indeed have been great if he had not committed this lesser one. Thank Messer Traiano for giving me this information of a fact which I had not heard before." Then he turned and in presence of the nobleman said to the Bishop of Friuli, his gentleman and intimate acquaintance, "Search diligently after my friend Benvenuto; I want to help and defend him, and whoso acts against thyself acts against myself." The Milanese nobleman went back, much disconcerted, while the Bishop of Friuli came to visit me at Cardinal Cornaro's place. Presenting himself to the Cardinal, he related how Cardinal de' Medici had sent for Benvenuto, and wanted to be his protector. Now Cardinal Cornaro, who had the touchy temper of a bear, flew into a rage, and told the Bishop he was quite as well able to defend me as Cardinal de' Medici. The Bishop in reply entreated to be allowed to speak with me on some matters of his patron which had nothing to do with the affair. Cornaro bade him for that day to make as though he had already talked to me. Cardinal de' Medici was very angry. However, I went the following night, without Cornaro's knowledge, and under a good escort, to pay him my respects. Then I begged him to grant me the favour of leaving me where I was, and told him of the great courtesy which Cornaro had shown me, adding that if his most reverend lordship suffered me to stay, I should gain one friend the more in my hour of need; otherwise his lordship might dispose of me exactly as he thought best. He told me to do as I liked, so I returned to Cornaro's palace, and a few days afterwards the Cardinal Farnese was elected Pope. After he had put affairs of greater consequence in order, the new Pope sent for me, saying that he did not wish any one else to strike his coins. To these words of his Holiness a gentleman very privately acquainted with him, named Messer Latino Juvenal, made answer that I was in hiding for a murder committed on the person of one Pompeo of Milan, and set forth what could be argued for my justification in the most favourable terms. The Pope replied, "I knew nothing of Pompeo's death, but plenty of Benvenuto's provocation; so let a safe conduct be at once made out for him, in order that he may be placed in perfect security." A great friend of Pompeo's, who was also intimate with the Pope, happened to be there; he was a Milanese, called Messer Ambroglio. This man said, "In the first days of your papacy it were not well to grant pardons of this kind." The Pope turned to him and answered, "You know less about such matters than I do. Know then that men like Benvenuto, unique in their profession, stand above the law, and how far more he, then, who received the provocation I've heard of. When my safe conduct had been drawn out, I began at once to serve him, and was treated with the utmost favour." 75. Messer Latino Juvenal came to call on me, and gave me orders to strike the coins of the Pope. This roused up all my enemies, who began to look about how they should hinder me; but the Pope, perceiving their drift, scolded them, and insisted that I should go on working. I took the dies in hand, designing a S. Paul, surrounded with this inscription, Vas Electionis. This piece of money gave far more satisfaction than the models of my competitors, so that the Pope forbade any one else to speak to him of coins, since he wished me only to have to do with them. This encouraged me to apply myself with untroubled spirit to the task, and Messer Latino Juvenal, who had received such orders from the Pope, used to introduce me to his Holiness. I had it much at heart to recover the post of stamper to the Mint; but on this point the Pope took advice, and then told me I must first obtain a pardon for the homicide, and this I should get at the Holy Mary's Day in August, through the Caporioni of Rome. I must say that it is usual every year on this solemn festival to grant the freedom of 12 outlaws to these officers. Meanwhile, he promised to give me another safe conduct, which should keep me in security until that time. When my enemies perceived that they were quite unable to devise the means of keeping me out of the mint, they resorted to another expedient. The deceased Pompeo had left 3,000 ducats as dowry to an illegitimate daughter of his, and they contrived that a certain favourite of Signor Pier Luigi, the Pope's son, should ask her hand in marriage through the medium of his master. Accordingly the match came off, but this fellow was an insignificant country lad, who had been brought up by his lordship, and, as folks said, he got but little of the money, since his lordship laid his hands on it, and had the mind to use it. Now the husband of the girl, to please his wife, begged the prince to have me taken up, and he promised to do so when the first flush of my favour with the Pope had passed away. Things stood so about 2 months, the servant always suing for his wife's dower, the master putting him off with pretexts, but assuring the woman that he would certainly revenge her father's murder. I obtained an inkling of these designs, yet I did not omit to present myself pretty frequently to his lordship, who made show of treating me with great distinction. He had, however, decided to do one or other of 2 things: to have me assassinated, or to have me taken up by the Bargello. Accordingly he commissioned a certain little devil of a Corsican soldier in his service to do the trick as cleverly as he could, and my other enemies, with Messer Traiano at the head of them, promised the fellow a reward of 100 crowns. He assured them that the job would be as easy as sucking a fresh egg. Seeing into their plot, I went about with my eyes open, and with good attendance, wearing an undercoat and armlets of mail, for which I had obtained permission. The Corsican, influenced by avarice, hoped to gain a whole sum of money without risk, and imagined himself capable of carrying the matter through alone. Consequently, one day after dinner, he had me sent for in the name of Signor Pier Luigi. I went off at once, because his lordship had spoken of wanting to order several big silver vases. Leaving my home in a hurry, armed, however, as usual, I walked rapidly through Strada Giulia toward the Palazzo Farnese, not expecting to meet anybody at that hour of the day. I had reached the end of the street and was making toward the palace, when, my habit being always to turn the corners wide, I observed the Corsican get up and take his station in the middle of the road. Being prepared, I was not in the least disconcerted, but kept upon my guard, and, slackening pace a little, drew nearer toward the wall, in order to give the fellow a wide berth. He on his side came closer to the wall, and when we were now within a short distance of each other, I perceived by his gestures that he had it in his mind to do me mischief, and seeing me alone thus, thought he should succeed. Accordingly I began to speak, and said: "Brave soldier, if it had been night you might have said you had mistaken me, but since it is full day, you know well enough who I am. I never had anything to do with you, and never injured you, but should be well disposed to do you service." He replied in a high-spirited way, without, however, making room for me to pass, that he did not know what I was saying. Then I answered: "I know very well indeed what you want and what you are saying, but the job which you have taken in hand is more dangerous and difficult than you imagine, and may peradventure turn out the wrong way for you. Remember that you have to do with a man who would defend himself against 100, and the adventure you are on is not esteemed by men of courage like yourself." Meanwhile I also was looking black as thunder, and each of us had changed colour. Folk too gathered round us, for it had become clear that our words meant swords and daggers. He then, not having the spirit to lay hands on me, cried out: "We shall meet another time." I answered: "I am always glad to meet honest men, and those who show themselves as such." When we parted, I went to his lordship's palace, and found that he had not sent for me. When I returned to my shop, the Corsican informed me, through an intimate friend of his and mine, that I need not be on my guard against him, since he wished to be my good brother, but that I ought to be much on my guard against others, seeing I was in the greatest peril, for folk of much consequence had sworn to have my life. I sent to thank him, and kept the best look out I could. Not many days after, a friend of mine informed me that Signor Pier Luigi had given strict orders that I should be taken that very evening. They told me this at 20, whereupon I spoke with some of my friends, who advised me to be off at once. The order had been given for 1 hour after sunset; accordingly at 23 I left the post for Florence. It seems that when the Corsican showed that he had not pluck enough to do the business as he promised, Signor Pier Luigi on his own authority gave orders to have me taken, merely to stop the mouth of Pompeo's daughter, who was always clamouring to know where her dower had gone to. When he was unable to gratify her in this matter of revenge on either of the two plans he had formed, he bethought him of another, which shall be related in its proper place.
Your saga may vary.